All right, guys, we're going to go through chapter 1 today, and I am going to try to keep this lecture to about 20 minutes. And if we need to divide it up, that's what we'll do. So your first chapter is the Vertebrate Story, and we're going to just touch on sort of the diversity of vertebrates, some of the defining characteristics and features, and get a feel for these organisms that we'll be focused on this semester. So, life on Earth began 3.5 billion years ago, but vertebrates have really only been part of the story for about the past 500 million years. Humans are just a blip on that timeline, having shown up about 165,000 years ago. Vertebrates have really successfully adapted to almost every habitat on Earth. Our understanding of vertebrates has grown steadily with a lot of focused research and thought and time. And our understanding of vertebrates is really essential to maintaining vertebrate populations, managing populations, and mitigating for human impacts. Only Insecta, part of Arthropoda class Insecta, surpass vertebrates as far as their global distribution and the extent of adaptations that we see. I wanted to remind everyone of the kingdoms that we see amongst living organisms. Vertebrates, of course, fall within Animalia, and all multicelled organisms that are animals. We'll touch on classification more in our next chapter, but I just wanted to give a quick reminder of taxonomy and systematics are really important to the study of vertebrates. We'll return to it over and over again during the course of the semester. So how do we classify a species? The mnemonic I learned was kings play chess on fine-grained sand, to remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But today we're talking about phylum Chordata. And I want to focus in on really the most important characteristics, those that define this phylum that we belong to. So in this figure, the features that are highlighted in white are the shared characteristics that we see in all chordates: a notochord, a dorsal hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal gill slits, and a postanal tail. The notochord, if you haven't studied it before, is an elongated rod-like skeletal structure that we see along the ventral side of the organisms that maintain it into adulthood. It shouldn't be confused with the backbone or the vertebral column that we see in most adult vertebrates. It's a much more primitive form of that. It appears really early in embryology and plays an important role in promoting and organizing embryonic development in vertebrate species. In most adult chordates, the notochord really entirely disappears and becomes highly modified. In some non-vertebrate chordates and fishes, the notochord actually persists as a skeletal rod, giving support and somewhat functioning like the vertebral column. The nerve cord of chordates develops dorsally in the body as a hollow tube above the notochord. In most species, it differentiates in embryology, so during the early phases of development, into a brain and into a spinal cord that runs from trunk to tail. Together, the brain and spinal cord make up our central nervous system, and all of our senses are connected to that. The visceral clefts and arches, also called the pharyngeal gill slits, found in chordates, also diversify in aquatic and terrestrial organisms In aquatic organisms, we see pharyngeal gill slits turning into gills. And in terrestrial organisms, they actually, through the process of embryology, as we develop into our adult selves, they turn into the inner ear and into a lot of the facial muscles and make up part of our facial structure. And then, of course, the postanal tail we see retained in some organisms and totally lost in others as they move into their adult form. We're going to talk through 3 subphyla of chordates: Cephalochordata, Urochordata, and Craniata. And we'll touch on the differences amongst these organisms. First, I wanted to show you guys, again, just these are figures showing the various features of chordates and when we might see those in these different types of organisms. So in the Cephalochordata in the adult stage, in larval tunicates, in larval lamprey, and then also in the embryonic early stages of development in tetrapods like us. So what is a Cephalochordata? These small, really kind of unusual fish-like creatures are part of their own subphylum. They're often called lancelets. The animals are fish-like in appearance. They're aquatic. Most of them are invertebrate, with retaining their notochord into adulthood, and then the nerve cord right above it. They lack bones, they lack a brain and eyes. Most other organs and most of the other organs associated with the brain. There are only about 25 species in this subphyla. I've got a video here that you can link to and actually watch Cephalochordata in action. The Urochordata, also known as tunicates, are really interesting creatures. They show the characteristics of early on in development of a chordata. When they move into their adult form, really turn into these wild, almost mushroom-like sessile, meaning fixed, marine animals. And I've got a video here where you can see sea squirts in action as well. Gill slits in these organisms function for feeding and for gas exchange. They it's sort of hard to believe they're in the same phylum as humans. They get their name, tunicates, from that outer structure that you see in the adults, made up of just sort of gelatinous cellulose, which is really rare in animals. And that covering on this adult is known as a tunic. And then we move into the Craniata, the group that vertebrates belong to. Some of the features that we see in this group are well-developed brains, 10 to 12 pairs of cranial nerves associated with the brain, cartilaginous or bony endoskeleton is usually present. Often paired appendages are present. Usually the sexes are separate. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple of the infraphyla. So the hagfish group is really off on their own. They are not quite vertebrates. They have an eel-like body, a cartilaginous skeleton. They lack paired appendages. They use gills for gas exchange. And hagfish were excluded from vertebrata because they lack even rudimentary vertebral elements. They were once grouped with lamprey, which share a lot of their characteristics. But because lamprey have a stiff notochord that functions like a vertebral column, these two were split. taxonomically. So this is a picture of an adult lamprey that can get quite large. And you can see in this photograph, actually, one of their more interesting behaviors. Lamprey can use that sucker mouth to affix themselves to a rock when swimming upstream in order to rest. It's interesting just to sort of reflect on the distribution that we see of the various craniates amongst the different subphylum types. There really is incredible diversity within this group. Adult vertebrates range from the tiniest fish, a member of the carp family that's only about 1/3 of an inch long, to the largest mammals, the blue whales that are 30 meters long and 271,000 pounds. So wide ranging and diverse vertebrates occupy almost every habitat on Earth. And that 500 million years of evolution has really allowed them to diversify and occupy. I'm going to go through some terms for you guys that will come up over and over again throughout the semester. There is an emphasis with vertebrate evolution on thermoregulation. So temperature regulation is really important in the vertebrate strategy. And we roughly divide our vertebrates into two groups: ectotherms, or cold-blooded organisms. That includes most of our fish, salamanders, frogs, turtles, and snakes. And endotherms, which we refer to as homeothermic, maintaining a constant temperature. Birds and mammals fall in this group. Homeothermy requires quite a lot of energy and there must be a strategy that goes along with acquiring the energetic supplies to keep a constant body temperature. There are some strategies that we see even within endotherms where they can lower their body temperature to reserve resources. And we see this when it's done over a short period, even just at night sometimes, with, say, chickadees in a state that we call torpor, and for a longer term, for like a season, as we see in hibernation. Other vertebrate features include the body forms that we see really interesting and diverse body forms, again, that will apply to the strategy and life habits of a lot of these organisms. In fish, we see several forms, including fusiform, depressiform, as in skates and rays, and then the compression sagittiform that we see in angelfish. And then once we move into our terrestrial and aerial locomotion, there's a whole additional array of body forms that we see. And this graph is just comparing the form of these two jumping organisms and how the tail was lost on frogs, but not lost on kangaroos. Skin is an essential organ that we see in vertebrates, and we really saw it change quite a bit in the evolution from aquatic life to land life. The function of skin, you guys probably know from prior coursework, is protection, temperature regulation, storage of calcium, synthesis of vitamin D, maintenance of water and electrolyte balance, excretion, gas exchange, defense against invasion of microbes, reception of sensory stimuli, and production of pheromones. So just a wide array of functions that the skin that the skin plays. We saw a division in the epidermis that was necessary for the transition from land to water. And then as organisms, so that first leap really from fish to amphibians, we saw that division of the epidermis, and then a further hardening of the corneum in reptiles as we saw amphibians transition into reptiles and become really more and more terrestrial and less reliant on life around water. The development of an endotherm gave rise to feathers and hair from the skin. Feathers are just modified scales that provide insulation and, of course, the benefit of flight in birds. Hair serves primarily for insulation, but also for protection. And then some vertebrates developed an epidermal scale underlain by a bony plate, like in turtles, to be used as armor. And then we see a similar strategy in armadillos. The vertebrate skeleton is fascinating to look at as well. And so, of course, the vertebra itself is the center point of the vertebra skeleton. We see often a relatively similar structure with the neural arch, including the spinal cord and the hemal arch below that encloses blood vessels. It's worth reflecting on appendages also that we see in the vertebrate skeleton and mentioning something I'll go into in more detail, what we would call homologous structure, and a homologous skeletal structure of these limbs of the different vertebrates shows the shared ancestry amongst all of these organisms. But terrestrial limbs really evolved and elongated into 3 different sections, whereas we saw the more primitive limbs in 1 or 2 sections. And one of the interesting things that we see actually in running animals is the reduction in the number of digits that we see. We saw this evolve independently in running mammals and in running birds, like the ostrich. It's fun to spend a little bit of time with this graph and think through the huge modifications that occurred in the different types of locomotion used by tetrapods as they moved into different ecological niches. And this figure spells out, different organisms that we see these different types of locomotion in. Graviporial are organisms that support huge body weight, like the elephant. Cursorial are running animals. Volant are gliding. Aerial organisms like bats are flying. Salatorial are jumping. Aquatic or swimming. Fossorial organisms like moles are digging. Scansorial, like squirrels, are climbing, and arboreal, of course, are organisms that are adapted to life in trees. I'm going to stop here and pick this slide up in our next section of the lecture.